The convoy sailed exactly as it was told. It departed on time. It followed assigned lanes. It maintained escort spacing. It observed radio silence. It adjusted speed according to doctrine. Every decision had been approved in advance. From the bridge, there was no reason to expect disaster. The weather was tolerable. The escorts were alert. Air patrols had reported nothing unusual. On paper, this was how a convoy survived the modern ocean. Yet none of the ships would reach their destination. Not because of recklessness, not because of bad luck, and not because of a single catastrophic mistake. They followed every rule, and that was the problem. By the time the last distress signal crackled into the ether, Japanese Naval Command would realize something chilling: the enemy no longer needed them to make errors. The system itself had become predictable enough to kill. By 1943-1944, Japan's war at sea had entered a dangerous phase. The Imperial Japanese Navy still possessed skilled crews and determined commanders, but its logistical reality had changed. Oil shortages limited escort availability. Aircraft were increasingly tied to homeland defense, and merchant shipping, never abundant to begin with, had become the backbone of Japan's ability to continue fighting. Convoys were no longer optional. They were survival. In response, Japanese naval planners tightened doctrine. Convoy procedures were standardized. Routes were carefully selected. Escorts were trained to follow prescribed patterns designed to counter submarine attack. Every lesson learned since the early losses of 1942 was written into manuals and enforced rigidly. From Tokyo, it looked like progress. Convoys would sail only at approved times. Routes would avoid known patrol zones. Zigzag patterns were standardized. Radio silence was absolute. Escort commanders were instructed not to improvise. The intention was discipline. The effect was uniformity. What Japanese command did not fully grasp was that Allied submarine warfare had evolved just as rapidly, but in a very different direction. American submarines were no longer hunting mistakes. They were hunting systems. By late 1943, U.S. submarine commanders had begun mapping convoy behavior statistically. Not just where ships sailed, but how strictly they adhered to doctrine. Repetition created expectation. Expectation created opportunity. A convoy that followed every rule was no longer safe. It was visible. What followed was not a reckless ambush, but a calculated interception, built on the certainty that obedience had replaced adaptability. And once the convoy entered the trap, there would be no dramatic escape, only silence. The officers aboard the convoy did nothing wrong. That is what made the loss so devastating. Their charts were correct. Their orders were followed. Their escorts stayed in formation. But somewhere beyond the horizon, an American submarine commander was already waiting, not because the convoy had been detected, but because it was inevitable. This was not a story of failure. It was a story of what happens when war becomes procedural, and the enemy learns to read the procedure better than you do. The convoy had a name, a schedule, and a doctrine behind it. It was Convoy HI-71, assembled in August 1944, tasked with moving desperately needed fuel, troops, and equipment from Singapore toward the Japanese home islands. By this stage of the war, such convoys were no longer routine commerce. They were lifelines. Japan's position was already fragile. American submarines had devastated shipping throughout 1943. Oil imports were collapsing. Warships were idle for lack of fuel. Aircraft sat grounded. Every convoy that sailed carried the weight of strategic survival. HI-71 was designed to be different. It followed the most up-to-date Japanese anti-submarine doctrine. Escort strength was reinforced. Routes were selected to minimize exposure. Timing was chosen to avoid known patrol concentrations. Escort commanders were explicitly instructed not to deviate from the plan. The convoy consisted of over a dozen merchant vessels, including tankers and troop transports, escorted by a powerful screen of destroyers, K-Bahkan's escort vessels, and even major surface combatants. Among them was the escort carrier Tei, tasked with providing air cover. On paper, this was a hardened convoy. Its commanders believed that discipline, rigid, methodical discipline was the antidote to submarine attack. The era of improvisation was over. Submarine threats would be met with consistency. What they did not realize was that consistency had become the vulnerability. By mid-1944, American submarine warfare had entered a new phase. Earlier in the war, U.S. submarines hunted visually, opportunistically. Captains stalked ships they happened to encounter. Success depended on luck, visibility, and patience. That phase was over. Submarine Command had begun analyzing Japanese shipping as a system. Patterns were identified. Convoys departed on predictable cycles. Routes favored, safe. Corridors repeatedly escort behavior, followed rigid templates, zigzag intervals, where standardized reaction to contact loss was scripted. These patterns were compiled, mapped, and circulated. Submarines were no longer reacting to shipping. They were waiting for it. In the case of Convoy HI-71, multiple American submarines were already positioned along likely routes. Not because they had detected the convoy, but because doctrine said this is where a convoy that follows the rules must go. Among those submarines was USS Redfish, commanded by Lewis McGregor, operating in coordination with other boats in the region. Redfish did not stumble upon HI-71. She anticipated it. When contact was finally made, it was not dramatic. Radar returns, faint silhouettes, engine noise where it was expected, not where it was surprising. The convoy was exactly on schedule, which meant the interception geometry was already solved. The first attack did not annihilate the convoy. It destabilized it. In the early hours of August 18, 1944, American submarines began coordinated attacks. Torpedoes were fired not at random targets, but at key nodes, tankers, command ships, and vessels whose loss would force doctrinal responses. USS Redfish launched torpedoes at Teiu, the escort carrier, operating exactly as instructed, maintaining station, maintaining speed, had little room to maneuver. When the torpedoes struck, the damage was immediate and fatal. Tei sank. With her went the convoy's organic air cover. Japanese escorts responded exactly as doctrine dictated. They tightened formation. They increased speed temporarily. They conducted depth charge sweeps along prescribed arcs. They maintained route integrity, and in doing so, they made the situation worse. Because submarines had already adjusted for those responses. Each defensive maneuver pushed merchant ships into predicted lanes. Each escort maneuver thinned coverage elsewhere. Every attempt to preserve order increased exposure. Over the next hours, additional ships were hit. Tankers burned, transports slowed. Disabled ships forced the convoy to either abandon them or reduce speed. Both options already accounted for by American commanders watching from below. The ocean became chaotic, but the decision-making was not. Japanese escorts continued to follow the book. That book had already been read. Once Tei was lost, Convoy HI-71 was doomed, not tactically but structurally. Without air cover, escorts relied entirely on sonar and doctrine. Submarines exploited this by attacking from unexpected bearings, then withdrawing just far enough to force escorts into repetitive patterns. Japanese commanders faced a dilemma: deviate and risk court, marshal for abandoning doctrine, or comply and hope discipline would prevail. Most chose compliance. By the end of the engagement, multiple ships had been sunk or damaged, including vital tankers. Survivors limped back or scattered. The convoy never reassembled. Its mission failed. From Tokyo's perspective, the loss was incomprehensible. There had been no obvious mistake, no reckless behavior, no intelligence failure, no single catastrophic decision. Only obedience. And that was the most disturbing lesson of all. After HI-71, Japanese naval planners faced a brutal realization. Their convoy system was too legible. Submarines did not need better weapons. They did not need better luck. They only needed time to study behavior. Attempts were made to loosen doctrine, but by 1944, Japan lacked fuel, escorts, and training capacity to support flexible operations. Convoys became smaller, slower, and less frequent. The spiral accelerated. For the Allies, HI-71 confirmed something equally important. You could defeat a system without ever surprising it. You simply had to understand it better than it understood itself. Convoy HI-71 did not vanish in a single dramatic moment. It unraveled. In the days following the attacks, Japanese Naval Command struggled to reconstruct what had gone wrong. Damage reports arrived fragmented. Some ships limped back independently. Others never reported again. The escort carrier Tay was confirmed lost, taking with it trained pilots' aircraft and the convoy's only mobile air defense. Fuel tankers, arguably the most critical cargo, were among the hardest hit. This mattered more than tonnage statistics suggested. By mid-1944, Japan's operational problem was not a shortage of ships. It was a shortage of fuel in the right place at the right time. Losing tankers meant warships sat idle. It meant air units curtailed training. It meant emergency rationing even within fleet commands. HI-71's failure compounded an already accelerating crisis. Within weeks, Japanese naval planners quietly revised convoy schedules, not by improving protection, but by reducing ambition. Convoys became smaller. Routes were shortened. Cargo priorities tightened. Entire shipments were delayed or canceled outright. Each adjustment was defensive. Each made the situation worse. Smaller convoys meant fewer escorts per ship. Delays increased submarine exposure. Fragmentation eliminated mutual support. What had once been a system designed to survive through order now degraded into isolated movements vulnerable everywhere. Allied submarines noticed immediately. Patrol reports from late 1944 describe a sharp increase in single ship movements and under-escorted pairs. Attacks became easier, not harder. Sinkings accelerated despite no major increase in submarine numbers. HI-71 had not been an anomaly. It was a demonstration. The convoy system Japan had perfected, meticulous, disciplined, rule-bound, could not survive an enemy that had stopped playing by fixed expectations. From an operational standpoint, this was devastating. Japan's war effort depended on moving oil from Southeast Asia to the home islands. By early 1945, that flow had dropped to a fraction of pre-war levels. Naval sorties were limited not by enemy pressure, but by fuel availability. Even major surface units were reserved for decisive battles that never came. The collapse was quiet. There was no single order acknowledging failure, no official doctrine reversal, just fewer convoys, fewer ships sailing, fewer resources arriving, and all of it traced back to the realization that following the rules no longer protected you. From a purely tactical view, HI-71 was one convoy among many. From a strategic view, it was a warning that came too late. Japanese naval doctrine had evolved under the assumption that discipline neutralized uncertainty. If every ship behaved correctly, the system would compensate for individual losses. That logic worked against disorganized opponents. It failed catastrophically against an enemy who understood the system itself. American submarine forces, operating under decentralized command, had learned to adapt faster than doctrine could be rewritten. Captains were encouraged to experiment, report, and adjust. Patrol areas were flexible. Engagement decisions were local. This asymmetry mattered more than technology. After HI-71, Japanese command faced a strategic impossibility. To remain predictable was to be intercepted. To become unpredictable required fuel, escorts, and training they no longer possessed. The Allies, meanwhile, benefited from compounding effects. Each convoy failure reduced Japan's ability to correct the next one. Fuel shortages reduced escort coverage. Reduced escorts increased losses. Increased losses worsened fuel shortages. By mid-1945, the Imperial Japanese Navy was effectively immobilized. Not destroyed in battle, but starved of mobility. Post-war Japanese assessments would acknowledge this bluntly: merchant shipping losses, not fleet engagements, had decided the outcome. Convoys like HI-71 were not defeats in isolation, they were symptoms of systemic exhaustion. Strategically, the Allies had achieved something remarkable. They did not outguess Japanese commanders. They did not surprise them tactically. They simply understood their procedures better than they did. After the war, Convoy HI-71 became a quiet case study, not a famous battle, not a heroic last stand. but a demonstration of how organizational rigidity fails under intelligent pressure. Modern military doctrine draws heavily from this lesson. Rigid routing, fixed schedules, and procedural predictability are now treated as vulnerabilities. Mission command, clear intent paired with local flexibility, became standard not just in navies, but across modern armed forces. HI-71's deeper legacy lies in this shift. It proved that systems optimized for control can become transparent. That discipline without adaptation creates patterns, and that patterns, once understood, are exploitable, even without surprise. The officers who sailed in HI-71 were not incompetent. They were obedient, and in modern war, obedience without adaptability can be fatal. This story does not end with an explosion. It ends with an absence, a convoy that never arrived, fuel that never reached its destination, ships that vanished without a defining moment. Convoy HI-71 followed every rule it had been given. Its commanders acted professionally. Its escorts held formation. Its ships obeyed doctrine to the letter. And that was precisely why it failed. World War II was not decided solely by weapons or numbers. It was decided by learning speed, by which side adapted faster than the other could respond. The Japanese convoy system had become efficient, but efficiency had hardened into predictability. Once the enemy understood the rules, obedience became exposure. This is an uncomfortable lesson. We prefer stories of error hubris or dramatic failure. HI-71 offers none of those. It offers something more unsettling, proof that doing everything right can still lead to disaster if the environment has changed. In war, as in any complex system, success depends not just on rules, but on recognizing when rules no longer protect you. Convoy HI-71 never reached its destination, but its loss explains why so many others wouldn't either. If you value deep, research-driven World War II history that goes beyond battles and explores how systems, decisions, and doctrine shaped the outcome of the war, consider liking this video and subscribing. These stories are drawn from operational records, patrol reports, and post-war analyses, revealing how wars are often lost not through mistakes, but through rigidity.